In his initial correspondence with me, RJ invited me to speak of themes from Till We Have Built Jerusalem, having to do with architecture and cities, as these relate to a certain understanding of human flourishing, artisanship, virtue ethics, and natural law that originate in Aristotle and have informed a long intellectual tradition of both Western architecture and Western urbanism. In addition to Aristotle, this tradition includes such figures as Vitruvius, St. John the Evangelist, St. Augustine, St. Benedict, St. Thomas Aquinas, Leon Battista Alberti, and countless working artists and architects, and is, in many local manifestations, what I'm going to refer to tonight as classical humanist urbanism. It's a tradition in which I and some of my colleagues at Notre Dame understand ourselves to be participants, and a tradition into which we are attempting to initiate our students. I should refer to this, actually. We're going to be talking about some foundational things to this understanding of classical humanist urbanism that I'm characterizing as the Catholic worldview and Catholic metaphysical realism. You don't have to be a Catholic to be a metaphysical realist, but metaphysical realism in its Catholic version, there's certain basic points, certain basic ideas. The first is that the world is real. The world is intelligible and can be known truly, even if only partially and perspectively, nevertheless can be known and known truly. Human beings flourish in accordance with reality truly understood. The world is good, albeit fallen and in need of redemption. That's a peculiarly Catholic thing. The world is teleological and moving toward its end, who is God. And the world is sacramentally charged, presenting arenas, occasions, and means for God's presence therein. Now, it's fitting that a program of classical humanist urbanism should exist within a Catholic university. And it's disappointing that similar programs do not exist in other Catholic universities or even other secular universities. Notre Dame is unique in this regard because although traditions of classical humanist urbanism are not exclusive to Catholic intellectual culture, they do fit quite comfortably within Catholic intellectual culture. Pre-modern societies and their architecture have been founded upon certain substantive metaphysical assumptions. I think I'm going to repeat myself here. These assumptions have been articulated more or less explicitly in historic Western culture, but are generally held even in pre-modern cultures that have not articulated them. Reality is real, is what it is fundamentally sacred. Human beings can know reality truly, even if all human knowledge is necessarily partial and mediated to us through narrative traditions, and even if some of what we think we know to be true turns out to be false. Human beings are simultaneously constrained by reality and also willful and rational agents, for whom reason is the capacity that enables us to order our lives both materially as artisans and morally as citizens and intellectually as knowers, from which it follows that we can only flourish by using both our reason and our will to better conform ourselves to reality truly understood. These three assumptions, reality is real, that we can know it, that we flourish when we accord with it, constitute the metaphysical realist foundation of traditional architecture and urbanism. From these three assumptions, several individual and collective existential challenges follow. One is to discern and articulate how the many different parts of reality relate to the whole of reality. Another is to understand material things and their properties, what we find in nature and what we make of nature, both in terms of their ends and in terms of what material things are and are not capable of being and doing. Yet another challenge is to recognize and articulate the teleological implications that follow from understanding that human beings flourish by conforming ourselves to reality. With respect to human settlements, this requires minimally that we recognize that cities and other human settlements, like everything else, exist within a context of sacred order. In a secular culture and secular age, it is by definition easy to overlook how in most pre-modern cultures, city-making was to some greater or lesser extent an act of cosmography, an attempt to make either the city itself or at least some precinct of it an imitation or representation of the cosmos. And we see here we've got four versions of that, iconic instances of classical humanist urbanism, implicitly at least. The detail from the Ghent altarpiece, a medieval woodcut of Rome, as defined by the three pilgrimage churches within the walls, Santa Maria Maggiore and St. John Lateran and Santa Croce in Jerusalem. Here's St. Peter's, St. Paul's outside the walls, and there's the wall, and that's this kind of cosmographical view of Rome understood as a sacred city in the Middle Ages. More imminently, we also need to understand cities as being constituted by reciprocal and simultaneous orders. Right? So cities exist in a context of sacred order, but they are themselves different kinds of orders that exist simultaneously and reciprocally. Every city is an environmental order, is a demographic order, is an economic order, is a moral order, and is a formal order. And finally, if we concur with the consensus opinion of the classical humanist tradition itself, that cities exist to facilitate human flourishing, we are challenged to understand that any relationship between human flourishing and places ordered toward that end require us to understand human beings in our several dimensions, as animals, as social beings, as artisans, as moral agents, and as thinkers who make, order, intend, and symbolize, and also to understand architecture and cities as artifacts made by embodied social beings who endow those artifacts with symbolic meaning. Metaphysical realism is implicit in the West's oldest, specifically architectural treatise, the De Architectura of Vitruvius, a work that characterizes durability, comfort, beauty, and decorum as virtues necessary each and collectively to the art of good building. Durability, comfort, beauty, and decorum. Virtues so apparently self-evident that even today, most non-architects would be surprised to learn that cumulatively these virtues are normative in neither the Architectural Academy nor the profession of architecture, and have not been for quite some time. Instead, both the Academy and the profession generally operate under entirely different assumptions than those of classical humanist urbanism. The move away from classical humanist urbanism was initiated by the early 20th century advent of modernist architecture and urbanism, but it's important to remember that modernism too was born of ideals and also with implicit ideas about human nature. Modernism burst on the scene in the first half of the 20th century as the urban and architectural equivalent of the French Revolution. It succeeded in large part because it bespoke a secular gospel delivered in the context of both an ongoing general crisis of modernity and a specific moment of acute crisis in the immediate aftermath of World War I. In the modernist narrative, the Great War was a purging fire, and the message of modernism was simultaneously one of progress, inevitability, scientific rationality, and the coming of a secular and imminent utopia. Given its revolutionary and mythic intentions, modernism required an aesthetic similarly revolutionary and mythic, a symbolic rejection of 19th century bourgeois European culture tout court. Gone were the church and the town hall as the monumental buildings of modern city plans, replaced by monumentalized electrical power plants, workers' housing, and office buildings. Where the tradition was hereditary and organic, modernism would be rational. Where the tradition was ornate, modernism would be spare. Where the tradition was corrupt, modernism would be pure. Where the tradition was for princes and popes, modernism would be for the people. For all but the most innocent modernist fellow travelers, modernism was always as much about morally charged aesthetics as about function, and not least about using the language of function as a club with which to batter the decadent culture of 19th and early 20th century Europe and the architecture that symbolized it. What underlying assumptions about nature and human nature informed the modernist revolution that overthrew the West's long tradition of classical humanist architecture and urbanism? The short general answer to that question is somewhat contradictory modern assumptions. Compared to the tradition it overthrew, modernism was and was not a metaphysical realist proposition. It was, insofar as many modernists seem to understand themselves as both mystical Platonists and scientific rationalists, promoting objective human goods in light of a modernist teleological understanding of both history and architecture. But was not, insofar as modernism increasingly came to be divorced from any transcendent grounding and reference, and increasingly became both more professedly utilitarian and more vulnerable to the seductions of a much sexier hypermodernism, which here refers to what outside the discipline of architecture is usually just called postmodernism. Most architects today would describe architectural postmodernism, or HOMO, as an embarrassing two-decade transitional period of dabbling in historical architectural forms that occurred in the 1970s and 80s in the aftermath of 1950s and 60s urban renewal and the triumph of corporate modernism. What I want to suggest here is that architectural and urban hypermodernism is most essentially modernism shorn of its confident consensus and moral and rationalist agendas. To put this another way, hypermodernism is modernism unmasked. Subjectivism, relativism, and individualism writ in and at the scale of buildings and cities. Hypermodernism is the architecture of the global economy, taking as premises modern material conditions and construction practices, as well as selected modernist aesthetic principles, but employing these not in service to some imminent utopian ideal, but rather for the sake of an aesthetic aspiration to novelty. This aspiration to novelty, in turn, serves well a contemporary urban condition that in the ontological assumptions of its several efficient causes, I think I can use those terms in this audience, in the ontological assumptions of its several efficient causes is empirical, this-worldly, secular, pragmatic, utilitarian, contractual, virtual, therapeutic, somewhat hedonistic, and effectively amoral. Especially in Western capitals of capital and today's exploding cities of Asia, Africa, and South America, hypermodernist architecture and urbanism are practiced by architects on behalf of autocratic governments, multinational corporations, and international developers and financiers as a de facto Nietzschean artistic enterprise in which there's not even the pretense of making legible urban form that serves human flourishing and civil society. That is, the historic ends of humanist urbanism, of which hypermodernism is a solvent. If generally architecture and urbanism represent aspirations to legitimate authority, it seems accurate to say that classical humanism sought to legitimate a civil society of multiple authoritative institutions that together promoted a shared understanding of human flourishing. That modernism sought to legitimate an effort to rationally order the built environment as part of a progressive movement toward a politically prescribed utopia, and that hypermodernism seeks to legitimate, in Philip Reif's suggestive formulation, the freedom of individuals, quote, to pursue an experimental life, end quote, in the context of a consumer-oriented global economy. In the hypermodernist universe of discourse, professions of environmental concern are the only moral qualifications to the primary theme of aesthetic innovation, but are unconvincing because such professions typically refer to projects and proposals that depend absolutely on modern global industrial methods of manufacturing and transport of materials that, taken all together, are of empirically doubtful long-term economic and environmental sustainability. So this is the background for the issue that tonight's presentation seeks to address. What, if anything, do Christian classical humanists in a Catholic university have to say about acknowledging the reality of God in the formal order of a modern American metropolis characterized by religious pluralism? And that's the rest of my talk this evening. The focus of my attention is modern-day Chicago, which is a blessing. My project would be immeasurably more difficult if I had to raise the question I am raising in the abstract, or raise it in the context of a city completely lacking any relationship to the classical humanist urbanist tradition. But that would not be Chicago, which is an increasingly hyper-modernist city in which nevertheless there are large footprints made a century ago by Daniel Burnham in which classical humanist urbanists can follow if we are attentive. And I should say something about this, just on the left. This is, again, an iconic modernist image of Le Corbusier's plan Voisin for the city of Paris. This is the Marais here that he tore down. This is the right bank over here. Here's the Louvre. And it was his vision of towers in the city of Paris. And on the right, a collage of existing iconic hypermodern buildings assembled in one place as a kind of icon of the hypermodern global city, which is an advertisement that appears often in the pages of Financial Times. So before I look at the Burnham plan, I just want to add that Catholic classical humanist urbanists cannot, or at least should not, avoid thinking about urbanism in the light of modern Catholic social teaching, some of the principles of which I'm illustrating on screen. And indeed, the project I'm about to show is, in its larger ambitions, steeped in Catholic social teaching. Nevertheless, the latter is a subject that, owing to time constraints, I can here only acknowledge as I move on to more strictly architectural and urban design registrations of sacred order. So I want to talk about sacred order and urban form, first in pre-modern Christian Europe, in modern America, where it faced the challenge of religious pluralism, and in the Notre Dame Plan of Chicago 2109, which also, in addition to dealing with religious pluralism, deals with the must necessarily deal with the challenge of secularism. So this is, on the right, the city of Bruges in Belgium, which I'm going to show this is the historic center of the city of Bruges, which I'm going to show just as a kind of paradigmatic European Christian city that was built in Christian culture. It's not, they're living off their capital, have been for a long time. And then this drawing on the right is from a series of drawings by a Viennese architect in the late 19th century called Camillo Sitte. And all of these buildings in black are churches, and their relationship, and the purpose of the drawing is to show the relationship of the churches to public squares, to public space in the city. So you can see, churches were embedded. The gray are buildings in which they were often embedded, or the buildings that they were adjacent to. But you can see this relationship between religious buildings and public space in that drawing. So in Bruges has one of these, one of these features I regard as, kind of a law of good urbanism, which is you need three things basically for good urbanism. You need a public space in which laws are promulgated and punishments are dealt out. You need a class of good masons, and you need a wealthy merchant class concerned about their eternal salvation. And Bruges had those things in abundance. But it was very much a Christian city, and it was not it wasn't an ecclesiastical center. It was not an imperial center. It was a merchant city, but it was a merchant city that was constrained by a very strong Christian culture. And so I'm just showing examples of churches. Of this example of a church, fronting a public square. This is the view from the church into the square. This is a view of the church entrance from across the square. So you had churches in Bruges that front, and this is typical of Christian culture, European cities, Christian European cities. You have churches that terminate axial vistas on the street, which is a way of making a building more important, is to terminate an axial vista with it. You have religious institutions other than the church, or specifically religious communities within. This is a béguinage. Actually, it was a religious order that was begun by the wives of crusaders in the 13th century. But it's very like a kind of monastic community. This is a plan of it here, but here's the church. It's organized around a green. It's really it's a spectacularly beautiful place. I mean, I hope if you've never been to Bruges, that you get a chance to go sometime, because the first time you see it, you do sort of feel like you've walked into a bit of a fairyland. So these are all taken, from inside the béguinage compound. They founded hospitals. This is St. John's Hospital that dates back to the 12th or 13th century. Of course, today it's a museum, but this is a picture, or actually a painting that depicts pretty much this view within the building today. And then you have one of the really striking things about Bruges is you've got these foundations, religious foundations, that were funded by lay people and lay religious organizations that created housing for widows and orphans, and they were they're called God's houses. Was the phenomenon, and here's just an example. Oops, I'll get this right one of these. So this is a phenomenon, or this is an example of one. It occupies this part of the block right here. It's unpretentious from the outside. It's even blank walls, but you go through the courtyard and you're in this building and you're in this context. These buildings are 400 years old. There's some that are 600 years old. They're now run by the Belgian government as low-income housing. But these were the artifacts that were produced by the Christian culture the Christian mercantile culture of Bruges. So, but that was a situation where there was a kind of where there was a shared cosmic view of the world, and modernity is not about that. Modernity is about contended views of the world. And so I want to talk next about sacred order and urban form in some examples in modern America. And I want to, again, go back to this idea of cosmography as being either a conscious or unconscious thing, where, whether it's the church building itself that is representative, that's a representation of the cosmos, or whether in some cases it's the actual plan of a city that is a representation of the cosmos, that this is what human beings do and have done prior to the modern age. So I just want to look at some examples of ways in which sacred order, again, go back to my original comments about how the metaphysical realist understanding, right, is that of urbanism is that cities exist, we all exist in every aspect of our being in a context of sacred order. And so what are the ways in which that's manifested itself historically in certain cities in the United States, actually in the plans of cities, even as much as in individual buildings. So this is an example. This is New Orleans. This is Jackson Square. And typologically, what I want to note about it is that there's a reciprocal relationship between the public space, the main square, and the church, which is the Cathedral of San Louie. It's the dominant building on the square. This is an aerial depiction of it. And simply to point out, in terms of its form, it's a centralized public space. It's a formal relationship between the church and the public space, and it's singular, right? There's one church on the square. So this is a different example from New Haven, Connecticut, which was founded as a 9-square grid. This is the 9-square grid, at the center of which was the green, was public square. So these are accretions, but that historic grid is this. And in the square, there are 3 churches. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So this is an example of a centralized formal order. Again, it's a formal relationship, but there are plural churches in one square. So this is Savannah, Georgia. which is another model. It's polycentric. Savannah is made up of wards at the center of which, I think 23 or 22 wards, at the center of each one of which there is a square, many of which are fronted by churches. Not all, but many are fronted by churches in historic Savannah. So it's polycentric, it's formal, it's plural, and there are multiple churches and multiple squares, but it's definitely a representation of a certain view of sacred order in the cosmos that increasingly acknowledges religious pluralism. And again, I would go back to this historic understanding, what I understand to be the historic understanding of religious pluralism in the United States, that it's something that exists and has been constitutionally protected because it implies the acknowledgement that the government is not competent to adjudicate between religious claims. And so it allows religious free exercise for precisely that purpose. So is Savannah. Is one that you're all familiar with. William Penn's plan for Philadelphia, which is centralized, organized at the crossing of Broad and Market Streets. It was actually a building, which is a secular building. In fact, the whole thing is secular. I think it's the plan that's that's cosmographic, but it's formal, it's multiple, in classic Quaker style. No churches, but again, cosmographic. So those are all examples of centralized patterns of settlement that are acknowledging existing within the context of sacred order. There are linear examples. They tend to be a little bit more ad hoc. This is something that probably occurs, scores, if not thousands, of American towns. But I noticed it when I was with students and taking a trip in Mississippi, and we went through Port Gibson, Mississippi, on Highway 61, and this is the route. This is the town, and this is the route, and all these red buildings are religious buildings, including a synagogue, interestingly. And so in less than 3/4 of a mile, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 churches fronting the main street through town, as it seems to be the place where churches congregate. That I think is a kind of ad hoc sort of acknowledgement of sacred order. But this also occurs at a larger scale and in a different kind of context, and here in a more formal kind of way. This is Washington, D.C., where, of course, the striking formal order of Washington, D.C. Is the axis and cross-axis that exists along the mall between the Capitol building and the Lincoln Memorial, and north-south from the White House to the Jefferson Memorial. But what most people don't know, or at least maybe most people do know, but I didn't know it for a long time, is that north-south axis actually extends in a way that I wasn't quite aware of. And what's of interest in this context is that if the axis and cross-axis really is marking the sacred order of the secular society, or of civil society, what starts to happen on this north-south axis is that you get about 25 or 30 religious buildings that locate themselves on 16th Street in about 4 miles. And so this is another example. It's linear, it's informal, it's plural. But I want you to keep in mind these sort of categorizations of formalized order, on the one hand, formal versus informal, and the notion of a linear order as opposed to a centralized order, and the notion of multiplicity, because those are critical issues. So I want to talk about sacred order and urban form in Chicago, and in Chicago generally, but more specifically in the Chicago, the Notre Dame Plan of Chicago 2109, and its relationship to the Daniel Burnham's 1909 Plan of Chicago. So in 1857, Chicago was a growing small town. It had a population of about 30,000, and it had a public square in which was City Hall. But opposite City Hall, there were all these red buildings are churches. Actually, this is what happens. This is where they were located originally. As the city grew, the churches transferred their location along what today is Wabash Avenue, but then was known as Church Street. Any of you know Chicago? Yeah, okay. So again, still in 1857, a little more detail about that. So here's the public square. Incidentally, this is Daley Plaza, right? So this is where, where Daley Plaza is today, and City Hall is over here. So this was the City Hall. Here were the two churches, actually a third church here. And that was, you see the location of churches within, and this is what they looked like. It's amazing how those are real photographs. But that was Chicago, that had these characteristics of a small town that gave some acknowledgement in its formal order to sacred presence. But then this is Chicago in 1900, when the city is 1.7 million people. It's the fastest growing city in the world. And that's what it looks like at the center of town, state, and Madison, which just completely overwhelmed. The real estate values just completely overwhelmed the possibility for churches to be in that location. Or at least it was too much of an incentive for them not to sell out and move somewhere else. So here's where it gets interesting. Chicago, my interest in Chicago vis-a-vis the idea of classical humanist urbanism and hypermodernist urbanism. What's interesting, the reason it's of interest to me is that in 1900, Chicago was hypermodern in its culture, in its in the nature of the culture, and I think you can understand what Daniel Burnham's project was, to bring classical humanist urbanism to bear on this hypermodern city as a civilizing influence. We'll see how he tried to do that. But this is downtown, the business district in Chicago, the Loop. In fact, here is the Loop. In 1900, which was where that photograph was just taken. And what I want you to note are a couple things. First of all, note the lakefront, right? Which it was a working lakefront. Railroad lines, ships in the Chicago River, a lot of construction going on in here. And this dot represents the location of where Burnham proposed the new City Hall to be. And what's interesting is he located it in his plan on something that's axial, but the axis doesn't exist yet. It doesn't even exist. The street doesn't exist. But he proposed that 10 years later as the site for the center, what he wanted to make as the center of the city. So that was Chicago in 1900. And then this is Burnham's symbolic intent in trying to civilize the city of Chicago. And of course, all this is part of Burnham's plan, right? It's that classical humanist organization that he inserts. But this is what he was inserting it on top of. This is the central business district of Chicago that we're looking at. So he proposed locating a civic center right here, which was a city hall, with an additional expanded commercial district here south of Congress Street. This is Congress Street. North is to the right on this, by the way. So the west west is up. So this is the existing loop. This is the proposed location for another business district that would make a symmetrical composition. This was the proposed location for the Civic Center. And so the intent was to locate, is to recenter the symbolic, to relocate the symbolic center of Chicago. And to relocate it along this, what he called the Grand Axis, that extended from City Hall a mile down through Grant Park, through this symmetrically composed lakefront and out to Lake Michigan. These are images of that Grand Axis and what he imagined for it. So what we're doing, in the top one, you're looking west, right? So this was a museum that was in the foreground. This is the lakefront here. This was a low museum. This was the 16-story wall of buildings along Michigan Avenue. And in the background is the outline of Burnham's City Hall right here. And then this is the sectional view of that. It's a cross-section taken through here looking to the right. So there's City Hall. There are these 16-story buildings. He's cut through them. And there's that museum. And out here's the lake. But this was the Grand Axis that Burnham created or proposed for Chicago for the new Civic Center. And this is a famous aerial drawing that was made by Jules Guerin as part of the plan of Chicago, the City Hall and the plaza located right there. And this was his rendering of the plan of Chicago's City Hall and the plaza fronting it. Chicago didn't turn out that way. The Burnham plan was actually adopted by the city of Chicago. Progress was made on it for about 20 years. It sort of stopped after about 1930. There's some of us who would argue that 90% of what makes Chicago livable today was built before 1940. But what happened, of course, after 1945, in particular in metropolitan Chicago, not just the city, but in the region, what happened were freeways and sprawl. So this is just your standard suburban arterial and development, but this is downtown Chicago. In fact, this is the Chicago Circle Interchange, and this was going to be the site of City Hall right there. We'll come back to this, but that's what happened. So I want you to look at the difference between what Burnham proposed in 1909 for this site, which is Halsted and Congress, which is the City Hall, the plaza, radiating avenues, the axis marking it as the center of the city, and what was built there eventually in 1966, which is the Chicago Circle Interchange, which is the meeting of all of the interstate highways that come into Chicago, was located at precisely that location. So in post-1945 metropolitan Chicago, there's freeways and there's sprawl, and there is no legible civic center. So it went from that proposition to this reality. And I love this quote from the bottom, which is from a standard, I'll read it. It's from a standard history of Chicago by reputed, well-known historians. And this is what they write about that location in the city. They write, "It's obvious to the student of Chicago today," this is written in 1973, "that a great deal of the plan has not commended itself to public attention, but many elements have become commonplace elements of the city. Among those features," emphasis added, "which have been implemented are the placing of the Chicago Circle, major focus of the city's expressway system, at a location originally designed by the plan as the Civic Center Plaza." Right? So they're arguing that this fulfilled the civic intentions of Daniel Burnham to locate that freeway interchange in that spot. So this is what Chicago looks like today. And what I want to argue, relative to what I had said earlier about hypermodernist urbanism, is that the symbolic content of the formal order of the city of Chicago is the order of modern capital. And I would Chicago being what it is, I would say that it's the order of modern crony capitalism. So this is a drawing that depicts the buildings and spaces within the city of Chicago. What's black is a building, what's white is the open space, and what you can see in this are the rights of way of the freeways, right? This is the Kennedy Expressway. It comes down here, it comes in here, reaches the Circle Interchange, continues south as the Dan Ryan, continues southwest as the Stevenson, continues west here as the Eisenhower, and this is the Circle Interchange, and that's where Burnham had proposed to locate City Hall. So this is the proposed redesign of that in the Notre Dame Plan of Chicago 2109, which is part of a larger ambition within the city of Chicago to repurpose all of the interstate rights-of-way as urbanized thoroughfares, as boulevards, as wetlands, as public transportation, so that it would continue to be a transportation corridor, but it would cease to be an interstate, and would become a connector of neighborhoods rather than a divider of neighborhoods. But in particular, we have proposed to repurpose this area, which is where the Circle Interchange is, and to relocate City Hall in the spot where Burnham had originally intended to do that. And so, but where Burnham, did I miss a slide? No, I didn't. Wow, something happened here. Okay, so where Burnham had, just the east-west axis ending on the civic presence of the City Hall. Our proposal is to make a north-south cross-axis that we characterize as the sacred axis. It'll be the Columbia. We name it the Columbian Exposition Boulevard, which, if you know anything about Chicago, is weighted. But where the civic axis is characterized by the monumental presence of a high-rise city hall, what's characteristic of the sacred axis is that it is an open boulevard of virtual infinite perspective. It doesn't terminate on anything at either end, but it's fronted by sites for, in this case, 12 religious buildings. That's what these colored dots are here, are sites for religious buildings that front this sacred axis. Now, we can talk later about implications of that and what the questions that arises, but that's the intention of our proposal. This was kind of the original ideagram that I was thinking of when we started thinking about the project. The project was undertaken by two different groups of students, graduate urban design students, and it was fascinating because this particular part of the project, and I should say, I spoke earlier today at the Collegium Institute at Penn about this project, but not about this subject. I talked about water and land use and transportation, all of these kinds of pragmatic things that are important parts of the life of any city, but none of the symbolic stuff. And I realized that I'd just gotten lost in my thought. So anyway, but this was so I know. So it was when we started working on the project, we were trying to solve a lot of pragmatic questions. But there's always this symbolic issue of how to represent sacred order in a modern metropolis. And what was fascinating is that the first class of students that worked on it, there were 7 or 8 of them, but I think there were 3 Catholics, 2 Seventh-day Adventists, 2 Baptists, and a Hindu. Right? And that was the group. So I mean, it's American religious pluralism, all in my studio. But what was interesting is that they had all internalized the idea that religion is private. And so they were really nervous about this idea of marking sacred order in the physical plan of the city. Or, as you'll see, to the extent that they were willing to do it, they wanted to do it not in a big Baroque way, where there's a kind of a sacred space that is at the scale of the civic and at the scale of commerce, but they wanted to do it in localized areas, the way you would find in a neighborhood or in a small town, and all that's great, but that's an issue again we can talk about. But so this was my original thinking was something like that, but what they came up with was different. So here's this is the existing condition. They located City Hall here, but they made smaller squares that were fronted by churches, which and again I called it the William Penn plan. But it came out looking, like this, right? So here's City Hall, and this is one of those neighborhood churches. It's on a diagonal. It's got a monument in the center. It's a great public space. The church is very prominent on the public space, but it's not in any way, I would say, competing. And when I say compete, I mean I'm talking about it doesn't have equal gravitas, to the civic axis. So, but this is what they want to do. I thought they did it quite well. And this was the drawing that they did, where they reestablished the civic axis here. But again, it's the presence of sacred presence is something not as pronounced. Well, as the project progressed, and that class graduated, and I got some other assistants. We kept that idea. We don't force them to do anything, but as we developed the project, we took it back in this direction of the sacred axis. And so this was Burnham's plan in 1909, and this was the Notre Dame plan of 2109 with the sacred axis added. On the civic axis, we located the City Hall as the tallest building in the precinct. And this is an elevation of like 2 blocks, right, where you've got City Hall on this axis, and then you've got some infill buildings that are commercial buildings or apartment buildings with retail at grade but with the sacred buildings. This is a synagogue located here. This is a church located here. And it was just, the first couple, there's 6 on each side. And so that was, that was the civic axis. And then we, again, did this comparison of the plan for that intersection at Congress and Halstead, comparing Burnham, comparing to what is there now, comparing it to what we proposed, to be located in that spot. And this was the area that we were looking at, which this is an enlargement of that. It's 1.2 miles. This is Randolph Street, if you know Chicago. This is Roosevelt Road down here, 12th Street. And of course, this is Halstead and Congress right here. And this is what that is like at the same scale as other big-scale public spaces that found. These are, no, they're not all American because there's Paris. So here's the Columbian Exposition Boulevard, in the Notre Dame plan of 2109. This is Paris from the Arc de Triomphe down the Champs-Élysées through the Place de la Concorde and the Tuileries to the Louvre. This is Central Park. This is Grant Park in Chicago. So here's the Field Museum, Soldier Field, the Gehry, the Art Institute of Chicago. And then this is Washington, D.C., right? So Capitol Building, Lincoln Memorial, and Washington Monument. So that's the scale. And the scale is intentionally Baroque because in the classical humanist tradition, it's really only the scale of Baroque urbanism can kind of deal with the scale of the hyper-modern metropolis. So the buildings, the religious buildings, Will Herberg in the 50s, wrote about Protestant Catholic Jew, that this was and it was a certain kind of, certain kinds of Protestants, certain kinds of Catholics, and certain kinds of Jews that were part of America's religious establishment. It's much more diverse now, right? So, so what's actually depicted are 12 religious buildings that represent a multiplicity of the faiths that are found within Chicago to some extent. So there's a mosque, there's a Catholic basilica, there's a Buddhist temple, there's a Hindu temple, there's an Orthodox church, there's a Mormon temple, there's a synagogue, and there's a Protestant church. That's only 8. So there'd be some combination. So again, we're not determining who would be there. We're not even saying that only 12 churches could be there. We're imagining that some atheists would sue to either shut the whole thing down or to insist upon having atheist presence on the sacred axis. Fine, that's fine. If the 12 sites fill up, put a religious building in the middle of the block. Fine. But the point is that it's clear and it's fronted by sacred buildings. We'll come back to the question of whether in 100 years there will be religious communities. I suspect there will be. So that's the content of it. So this is the east elevation of the proposed Chicago City Hall, the church, the synagogue, and the church. We've seen a smaller version of this. And then this is the aerial view from the southwest, this proposed new high-rise City Hall and boulevard. And the boulevard is fronted here by sacred, this is the boulevard fronted by sacred buildings. A crossing of civic and sacred axes to replace the freeway interchange in Chicago's historic center. So talk about a religious revolution. And then this is a view down that sacred axis, which I think the presumption is that it's just an ordinary part of urban life, but it's available for gatherings of. It's the kind of place where rallies and protests and things like that would take place in a well-ordered city. And there's an aerial view of that sacred axis. And I guess the question is, the legibility has a lot to do with it. And what I was saying about hypermodern cities is that there's no formal legibility to it, that what the message that's conveyed is that it's the power of global capital. But the idea behind this is that somehow the sacred axis and the civic axis are both strong enough to compete with commerce in Chicago, which is strong, which is not going to go away, and which I think in our view, in civil society, there's in spheres of subsidiarity where there's competence in different realms, there's a recognition of the context of sacred order. There's a recognition of the legitimacy of civil society. There's a recognition of the legitimacy of commerce, and that's the kind of marking of the symbolic significance of sacred order in the city that we're looking to do. So this is a view looking east. It's a little easier to see, how that's marked, not least because we're proposing that the buildings that front this space be made out of the same material and the same color, so that it really, stands out as a precinct. In addition to being the center of a neighborhood. And then this is the historic center viewed from the southwest. There's fewer high-rises in Chicago, we imagine, in 2109 than currently exist. That's another story. Let's talk. Thank you very much.